Imagine you're attending a dinner party, and the host subtly hints that it's getting late by saying, "The night certainly flew by." In a high context culture, this might signal guests to start preparing to leave. In a low context culture, guests might simply agree that the evening has been pleasant and stay longer unless the host explicitly says, "It's getting late, let's wrap up." Understanding these differences is crucial, as miscommunications can significantly impact the effectiveness of the therapeutic relationship with a client. We all know that communication is more than just the words we speak. Over 50% of our communication happens through nonverbal cues, our facial expressions, tone of voice, gestures, eye contact, and even silence. While we may not always be conscious of it, the way we communicate is shaped by deeply ingrained cultural norms that dictate what is considered polite, respectful, or effective. Misunderstandings often arise when people from different cultural backgrounds have different expectations about communication. A direct statement in one culture might be seen as rude in another. A lack of eye contact in one culture may be a sign of respect, while in another, it could be misinterpreted as dishonesty. To better understand these differences, we turn to Edward T. Hall's framework of high context and low context communication. High context cultures rely heavily on shared knowledge, indirect speech, and nonverbal cues, while low context cultures prioritize directness, explicit language, and clear articulation of thoughts. In today's episode, we'll explore how communication styles affect relationships, therapy, and mental health. And we'll discuss real-life case studies where cultural communication differences led to misunderstandings. Most importantly, we'll look at how therapists and professionals can adapt their communication styles to ensure more effective and culturally competent interactions. Let's dive in. At its core, high context communication relies heavily on implicit understanding, nonverbal cues, and shared cultural knowledge. In contrast, low context communication is more direct, explicit, and verbalized. High context cultures are typically found in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. In these cultures, communication is indirect and subtle, and often relies on nonverbal signals, tone, and relationships rather than explicit words. In a high-context communication, a great deal of communication is based on shared experiences and social hierarchy. People may hint at things instead of stating them outright, expecting the listener to read between the lines. The tone of voice, pauses, and body language carry more weight than words, and direct criticism or disagreement is often seen as disrespectful. How does high-context communication work in different settings? In formal setting like work or business, the employees may use indirect phrasing to show deference to authority. Instead of saying, "I disagree," someone might say, "That is an interesting point. Perhaps we could explore other options as well." In informal settings, such as with friends or family, personal matters are often implied rather than directly stated. For example, instead of asking for help directly, someone might talk about their struggles and wait for an offer of assistance. In therapy setting, clients may avoid discussing problems openly, instead offering hints or talking around issues. A therapist unfamiliar with high-context communication might misinterpret this as reluctance or resistance to therapy. Low-context cultures found in the United States, Canada, Germany, and Scandinavian countries prioritize explicit, clear, and direct communication. In low-context cultures, messages are stated clearly with minimal room for interpretation. Nonverbal cues are secondary to verbal expression. Open discussions and stating one's opinions are valued, and direct language is often preferred over subtlety. How low-context communication works in different settings. In formal setting like work or business, employees are expected to speak directly and concisely. For example, if an employee disagrees, they might say, "I don't think that strategy will work, and here's why." In informal settings, such as with friends or family, people may openly express their emotions and opinions, even if it leads to disagreement. In therapy setting, clients tend to express their thoughts and feelings openly, expecting clear, actionable advice from the therapist. Let's study some cases. The scenarios are about therapists and clients from different cultural backgrounds. In the first case study, the client is Layla, a 35-year-old woman from Iran with a high context culture. The therapist is Dr. Smith, a 52-year-old psychologist from Canada with a low context culture. Layla is experiencing stress due to family pressures but struggles to express her feelings directly. During her therapy session, she speaks about her family in vague terms, saying things like, "Things at home have been complicated and I feel overwhelmed sometimes." Dr. Smith, coming from a low-context cultural background, expects clear, direct statements. He asks, "Can you explain exactly what is happening at home that makes you feel overwhelmed?" Layla hesitates. In her culture, discussing family struggles openly can feel disloyalty. Instead of answering directly, she speaks about general stress and tries to hint at the problem without naming it outright. Dr. Smith assumes she is avoiding the issue and responds with, "It sounds like you're not ready to talk about this yet. Let's focus on what you can control." Layla feels misunderstood. She was expressing her emotions in a culturally appropriate way, expecting the therapist to pick up on the underlying meaning and guide the conversation accordingly. She leaves the session feeling disconnected from therapy. How could this be handled differently? Instead of pressuring the client for direct answers, Dr. Smith could adapt his approach by using open-ended and culturally sensitive questions like, "Can you share a story about a recent situation at home that felt overwhelming? I understand that discussing family matters can be difficult. Would it be helpful to talk about general emotions before we get into details?" He could also observe nonverbal cues and slowly build trust, allowing Layla to express herself in a way that feels natural to her. Here is another case, this time a successful adaptation in therapy. Carlos, a therapist practicing in California, began sessions with Yuki, a Japanese client experiencing stress and anxiety. Initially, Carlos noticed Yuki rarely described his emotional state directly, but instead described exhaustion or physical fatigue. Carlos, recognizing high context communication, adapted his approach. He began to gently inquire about Yuki's physical descriptions, linking them to possible emotional states. Over time, Yuki felt more comfortable sharing deeper emotional experiences indirectly, knowing Carlos understood his implicit communication style. How misunderstandings arise between these two styles? 1. Indirect communication may be misinterpreted as avoidance. High context communicators may expect listeners to infer meaning from what is left unsaid. However, in a low context setting, this can be misinterpreted as dishonesty, avoidance, or lack of transparency. In a workplace setting, a Japanese employee, a high context, might say, "I will consider this idea carefully," instead of directly rejecting it. An American colleague, a low context, may assume the idea is still on the table, leading to confusion later. 2. Direct communication may be perceived as insensitivity. Low context communicators value clarity and efficiency, but in high context cultures, this can come across as rude or blunt. Example, a German manager, a low context, might directly tell an employee, "This work needs improvement." A Filipino employee, a high context, might find this embarrassing or overly harsh, as criticism is often delivered more subtly in their culture. Therapists need cultural competence to navigate these communication styles. A therapist familiar with low-context communication may need to enhance skills in recognizing nonverbal cues, contextual clues, and implicit meanings. Conversely, therapists working with clients from low-context cultures must encourage open, clear verbalization of thoughts and feelings. Here are some strategies for culturally sensitive communication. 1. Recognize your own communication style. Are you more direct and explicit, low context? Or do you rely on implied meaning and relationships, high context? Being aware of your natural style helps you adjust when interacting with those from different backgrounds. 2. Adapt to the client's cultural expectations. For high context clients, use storytelling, analogies, and relational language to facilitate discussions. For low context clients, provide clear, structured feedback and encourage open dialogue. 3. Use active listening and observation. Pay attention to nonverbal cues, tone, and pauses in high context communication. Encourage clarity and openness in low context interactions while being mindful of cultural sensitivities. 4. Build trust and flexibility in therapy. Recognize that trust develops differently across cultures. High context clients may need time before fully opening up. Adjust interventions based on the client's comfort level with direct or indirect communication. Understanding high context and low context communication is crucial for building effective relationships, whether in therapy, work, or everyday life. By recognizing these differences, we can reduce misunderstandings, improve connections, and create more inclusive spaces for meaningful conversations. I hope you'll join me in the next episode for another deep dive into the intersection of culture and therapy. See you next time.